Liberal reporter thought he could corner Karoline Leavitt, but he never expected her to turn the tables on him. The lights in the studio burned bright, reflecting off the sleek black desk where Bryce Langford sat, reviewing his notes for the third time. He wasn't just any journalist. He was a veteran of the game, known for his aggressive questioning and the way he could make even the most seasoned politician stumble. He had built his career on it, expose the contradictions, unravel the talking points, leave them scrambling. That was his strategy. And tonight he had his sights set on Karoline Leavitt. She had been making waves, young, confident, and completely unshaken by the relentless media storm that followed her. She was a rising star in conservative politics. But to Bryce, she was an opportunity, a chance to prove once again that the right-wing narratives didn't hold up under real scrutiny. His producers had fed him everything he needed, clips of her past interviews, social media posts, every stance she had taken. He had his angles mapped out: challenge her on policy, corner her on social issues, push her until she tripped over her own words. It had worked before. The control room buzzed with energy. Producers adjusted camera angles, a floor manager gave countdown signals, and in the wings, a makeup artist dabbed at Bryce's forehead one last time. He barely acknowledged it. His focus was locked on the chair across from him, the one that Karoline would soon occupy. "She's not ready for this," he muttered under his breath, rolling his pen between his fingers. "She's never faced someone like me." A deep breath. The theme music kicked in, signaling the start of the segment. The screen behind him displayed the bold, capitalized title exposing the right. An unscripted interview with Karoline Leavitt. The camera light blinked red. It was showtime, but then something shifted the moment she walked in. The moment Karoline Leavitt walked onto the set, something changed. Bryce expected nerves, maybe a flicker of hesitation in her eyes, a rigid stance that betrayed unease. But instead, she moved with the kind of confidence that caught him off guard. Shoulders back, head high, she slid into her chair like she had done this 1,000 times before. No fidgeting, no awkward glances toward the cameras. She offered a polite nod, crossing her legs as she rested her hands on the table, waiting. Bryce's usual smirk flickered for a moment, but he quickly recovered. He still had control. "Karoline, thanks for being here," he began, his voice even professional. "Thanks for having me, Bryce," she replied smoothly, her tone unreadable. The producers had lined up a segment full of hard-hitting questions, each one designed to force a defensive response. Bryce wasted no time. "You've positioned yourself as a fresh voice in conservative politics," he started, eyes scanning his notes. "But a lot of people say that you're simply repackaging outdated ideas with a younger face. What do you say to those critics who believe you're just carrying water for the same old Republican establishment?" A classic opening move. Frame her as a puppet. Force her to prove otherwise. Make her scramble. But Karoline didn't blink. She tilted her head slightly, as if she had already anticipated the question. It's interesting how when young progressives rise in politics, they're called trailblazers. But when a young conservative does, they're accused of just being a mouthpiece. Seems like a bit of a double standard, don't you think? The response was so fast, so sharp, that Bryce hesitated for a fraction of a second. He wasn't used to being thrown off balance this early. He adjusted, shifting gears. "Keep pressing." "That's not what I'm saying," he countered smoothly. "But let's talk about policy. You've been vocal in your opposition to certain progressive economic measures, yet many young people support them. Why should they listen to someone who's arguing against policies that they believe will help them?" Another trap? Make her seem out of touch with her own generation. But again, she didn't flinch. "Young people don't just support ideas because they sound good," she said, leaning forward slightly. "They support what actually works. And if you look at the states that have implemented these so-called solutions, you'll see higher costs of living, more businesses leaving, and job opportunities shrinking. Young Americans deserve real solutions, not just feel-good slogans." Bryce tightened his grip on his pen. The audience couldn't see it, but he could feel control slipping. Not completely, not yet. But the dynamic wasn't playing out the way he had planned. He glanced at the screen in front of him. The live comments were already flooding in. Some viewers were nodding along with him, but others were clearly engaging with her arguments. That was a problem. She wasn't supposed to be winning people over, but Bryce wasn't done yet. He still had tricks up his sleeve. Bryce forced a quick smile, a practiced move to mask the slight miscalculation in his opening attack. This wasn't the first time an interviewee had pushed back, but something about Karoline's approach felt different. She wasn't defensive. She wasn't scrambling. She was in control. Fine. Time to turn up the heat. He leaned forward slightly, voice steady but pointed. Karoline, let's be honest, your party has struggled with young voters. A majority of them reject conservative policies on issues like climate change, healthcare, and social justice. When you speak, aren't you just preaching to a shrinking audience? The phrasing was deliberate. Back her into a corner. Make her admit defeat. But again, she didn't hesitate. Bryce, if we're being honest, then let's actually be honest, she shot back, her tone calm but firm. Young people aren't rejecting conservative values. They're rejecting a version of conservatism that hasn't been properly explained to them. If all they ever hear is a media narrative that paints one side as villains and the other as saviors, of course they'll lean left. The problem isn't the message. It's the messengers. The way she delivered that last line, unshaken, deliberate, made Bryce shift in his seat. She wasn't just responding. She was taking control of the conversation. Still, he wasn't ready to give up ground. Time to go personal. He glanced at his notes, then at the camera. Some have criticized your rhetoric as being divisive, he said, voice carrying an air of concern. You've made strong comments about the media, calling certain outlets activists, pretending to be journalists. Do you think that kind of language helps bridge divides? Or are you just feeding into the partisanship that's tearing the country apart? That was supposed to make her sound extreme, make her backpedal. But she didn't. Instead, she let a small, knowing smile cross her lips. I find it interesting, Bryce, that when conservatives call out bias in the media, it's labeled divisive. But when the media runs hit pieces full of half-truths and anonymous sources, it's called investigative journalism. If people have lost trust in the press, maybe the press should take some responsibility for that. Bryce exhaled through his nose, just enough to steady himself. He had seen politicians dodge, deflect, pivot. But this was different. Karoline wasn't dodging. She was swinging back. The control room was quiet. No one dared interrupt the live broadcast. The tension between the two was almost palpable, and Bryce knew that audiences across the country were glued to their screens, waiting to see who would crack first. His earpiece crackled. One of the producers whispered a reminder. Stay on offense. He nodded slightly, eyes back on her. But this wasn't over. Bryce still had one more play, and this time he wasn't holding back. Bryce could feel it now. The shift in power. This wasn't going according to plan. He had prepared to grill Karoline Leavitt, to push her into a defensive posture where she would stumble, fumble, or at least give him a soundbite that could be clipped and circulated. But she wasn't playing the role he had assigned her. His producer's voice crackled again in his earpiece. Tighten the grip. Push her. Fine. Time to abandon subtlety. He leaned in, adjusting his tone to something colder. More surgical. Karoline, let's cut through the talking points. You've criticized the media for pushing a narrative, but isn't that exactly what you're doing? You present yourself as an outsider speaking truth, yet you're backed by political donors and powerful figures. How is that any different from the system you claim to oppose? It was a direct attack, one meant to undermine her credibility. If she hesitated, even for a moment, he could seize control of the conversation again. But Karoline didn't flinch. She tilted her head slightly, as if she were sizing him up. I'm glad you brought that up, Bryce, she said, her voice steady, because it proves my point. When a conservative gets backing, it's dark money and corruption. When a liberal candidate raises millions from Hollywood and tech billionaires, it's grassroots enthusiasm. It's fascinating how that works. Bryce felt his pulse tick up. He had another move, a riskier one. Since we're talking about narratives, he pressed. You've been accused of pushing misinformation, particularly regarding election integrity and media bias. Would you like to clarify some of your previous claims? This was his last-ditch effort. Throw a wide net and hope she got tangled in it. He needed a misstep, a fumble, anything to regain his footing. But instead, Karoline led a moment of silence. Pass before answering. She didn't rush. She didn't stumble. What's interesting, Bryce, is that you frame this as misinformation without specifying what exactly was false, she said, locking eyes with him. That's what the media does. You take a broad accusation, repeat it often enough, and expect people to just accept it as fact. So tell me, what exactly did I say that was false? Bryce's jaw tightened just slightly, but enough. He knew what she was doing. She was forcing him to be specific. And the problem was he hadn't actually prepared to debate details. His strategy had been to paint her with a broad brush, not to engage in the specifics. The seconds ticked by. The control room knew he was cornered. His producer's voice was in his ear again. Move on, move on. He swallowed and forced a small smirk, trying to make it seem like he wasn't affected. Well, Karoline, our viewers can judge for themselves. A weak pivot, a retreat disguised as neutrality. But Karoline had already won this round, and the audience knew it. Bryce could feel it now. He wasn't just losing control, he had already lost it. Karoline sat across from him, completely composed, her confidence unshaken. The more he tried to steer the conversation, the more she tightened her grip on the moment. And the worst part? The audience could see it. The live comment section was on fire. His producers were scrambling in his ear, throwing suggestions, but none of them mattered. He had to regain control himself, and there was only one way left to do it. He pivoted hard. Karoline, let's talk about accountability, he said, straightening his posture. His voice took on a sharper edge, a last-ditch attempt at regaining his footing. You speak about media bias, yet conservatives are no strangers to misleading claims and inflammatory rhetoric. Do you take responsibility for contributing to division in this country? Frame her as the problem. Make her justify herself. He watched closely, waiting for a sign of frustration, a tightening jaw, a flicker of annoyance, anything that showed he was getting to her. But Karoline didn't take the bait. Instead, she exhaled softly, just enough to show she had been expecting this. That's an interesting question, Bryce, she said, tilting her head slightly. Do you ask progressive politicians the same thing, or does accountability only run one way? A pause. A long, deadly pause. Bryce felt the silence crushing on him. She hadn't just answered his question. She had flipped it back on him, exposing the exact bias he was trying to deny. And worse, he had no way to wiggle out of it. He let out a small, controlled breath, but the damage was already done. The live chat was now brutal. People weren't just watching an interview, they were watching a demolition. Clips of the exchange were already spreading across social media, spreading faster than he could recover. He had come in expecting an easy win. Instead, he had become the story, and by the time the interview ended, Bryce Langford knew his moment of reckoning had arrived. The interview wrapped, but the tension in the studio remained thick. Bryce could hear his producer's voice buzzing frantically in his earpiece. We need to cut to break now. Too late. The second the camera lights switched off, the control room erupted into chaos. Tech scrambled to adjust feeds. A production assistant rushed over with notes that Bryce barely glanced at, and his co-host, seated off camera, just stared at him wide-eyed. Karoline, however, was unbothered. She stood up smoothly, adjusted her blazer, and gave a polite nod to the staff. "Thanks for having me," she said. Before walking off set, as if she had just finished a casual conversation, Bryce sat there, hands resting on the desk, his mind racing. He had lost not just the debate, but the entire narrative. It wasn't just the way she had answered, it was the way people were reacting to it. The network had banked on this segment being an exposure piece, a takedown that would fuel talking points for the rest of the week. Instead, within minutes, clips were already going viral, but not in his favor. Social media was ablaze. Did this guy just get steamrolled on his own show? I don't even like Karoline Leavitt, but she just humiliated this dude. The media always sets these traps. But this time the trap backfired. Bryce's face was everywhere. Screen grab meme mocked. A slow-motion clip of him blinking in stunned silence was already making the rounds. Even some left-leaning commentators were calling out the failure. His phone buzzed. Dozens of messages, some from colleagues trying to spin the damage, others from critics enjoying his downfall. But one stood out, A simple text from his network executive. Call me now. And that's when it hit him. This wasn't just a bad interview. This was a career moment. He might never live down. Bryce sat in his office, the door shut, the noise of a newsroom muffled, but not distant enough. He could still hear people talking. Whispers, hushed laughter, the occasional mention of his name. It was clear that everyone had seen it. His phone screen glowed with an onslaught of notifications. News outlets were picking up the story. Not the one he had planned, but the one that had actually unfolded. Karoline Leavitt flips the script on mainstream media. Liberal journalist gotcha moment turns into a cell phone. Another example of media bias exposed in real time. And then there was the video. It was everywhere. Not just the full interview, but clipped, edited, dissected from every angle. Some accounts had overlaid dramatic music. Others had added captions like when the trap backfires. Even pundits from his own side were struggling to spin it. A few tried, saying she dodged questions that he was just too polite, but no one was really buying it. He scrolled through Twitter. The top trend? His own name, Bryce Langford. Not for his reporting, not for his analysis. But for the moment he had lost control, he tossed his phone on the desk and exhaled. This was bigger than just one bad segment. This was a moment that exposed something deeper. For years, journalists like him had operated on a simple formula. Set the narrative, control the questions, shape the perception. It had worked before, but something had changed. The public wasn't trusting as easily. They weren't just listening. They were watching, analyzing, catching the double standards in real time. And in this moment, he had become an example of exactly what people were tired of. A knock at the door. One of the producers leaned in, looking cautious. Bryce, they want you in the conference room. He already knew what the meeting was about. Damage control. But deep down, Bryce wondered if it was already too late. Bryce sat at the long glass-topped conference table, surrounded by a room full of people who weren't there to support him. They were there to assess the damage. The executive at the head of the table, a man who rarely attended these meetings in person, leaned forward. Bryce, let's be blunt. This was supposed to be a controlled segment. Instead, it turned into an unmitigated PR disaster for you, for this network. Bryce knew better than to argue. He had spent his career on the other side of these conversations, dissecting public figures who fumbled under pressure. He understood the game, but knowing the playbook didn't make it any easier to stomach when it was being used against him. We need a response, another exec chimed in. Something that reframes the narrative before it completely runs away from us. Bryce rubbed his temples. So what are we talking? A follow-up interview? A column? The room fell silent. That's when it clicked. They weren't asking him how to fix it. They were deciding whether he was even worth fixing. One of the PR reps hesitated, glancing at the others before finally speaking. We're considering putting someone else in your time slot for the rest of the week, just to let things cool down. Let things cool down, Bryce swallowed hard. He knew what that meant, the polite first step in an eventual phase-out. Maybe they wouldn't fire him outright, but his reputation had taken a hit, and in this business. That was often enough to make you disappear. And all because he underestimated her. Karoline Leavitt hadn't just survived his interview. She had turned it into a defining moment for herself, for the public's trust in media, and for him as an example of everything people resented about his industry. He glanced at his phone again. The views were still climbing. The headlines weren't fading. The damage wasn't just done, it was permanent. And maybe that's the real lesson here. Arrogance always meets its reckoning. This wasn't just about one interview. It was about a shift in power, in trust, in control of the narrative itself. People aren't as easily manipulated as they once were. They see through the bias, the leading questions, the traps disguised as journalism. And when someone stands their ground, when they refuse to play by the script, sometimes it's the interviewer who ends up exposed. So the next time you see someone getting grilled on live TV, pay close attention. Are they answering, or are they fighting against a game that's already been rigged? Let us know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss what's coming next.